Words cannot express how much I don't want to play this game. If the first two Legend of Spyro games are anything to go by, this game is gonna be rough. My hope is that this game will be like resting on a soft, fluffy cloud, but my expectation is that it will be like wiping my ass with sandpaper. The first Legend of Spyro game was a new beginning, and it wasn't great. It was a game with a focus on mindless, repetitive combat. The only thing it had going for it was its implementation of the elemental breaths and a somewhat decent story. But even though it was a flawed game, I thought that it had potential. The Eternal Night had the opportunity to take a New Beginnings gameplay and expand it to make it fun and more interesting. But instead, it doubled down and somehow managed to make it worse by changing the elemental breaths and sucking out every drop of fun that could have been had. It was a massive disappointment, and it didn't even have a half-decent story to back it up. Dawn of the Dragon is the final game in the Legend of Spyro trilogy. This is its last chance to win me over. Can the Legend of Spyro Dawn of the Dragon redeem the trilogy, or will this be yet another crushing failure? I really don't want to do this, but I'm just gonna have to rip the band-aid off and get it over with. Here goes nothing. It's important to mention that when I reviewed The Eternal Night, I got so sick of the game that I didn't play it through to completion, so I didn't properly experience the end of the game. However, since then I have gone back and beaten it, specifically the Wii version. You can imagine how well that went, but I fought through the pain and witnessed the end of the game in its entirety. Dawn of the Dragon picks up a few years after the events of the Eternal Night. Spyro, Cinder and Sparks are still frozen in time in a crystal looking like the fossilized mosquito from Jurassic Park. They are freed by these disgusting gremlin things, who chain Spyro and Cinder together using magic snakes, as one does. As they awaken, they realize they are trapped, and are forced to fight against the gremlins who released them. And bam! We're straight into the action. I'm thankful for that. No long, drawn-out cutscenes with characters solemnly waffling on about nothing. We're free, we're here, let's dance. Perfect. Obviously, the thing that stuck out to me most was the fact that this game looks completely different to A New Beginning in the Eternal Night. It's almost unrecognizable, and that's not just in terms of visuals. I went into this game expecting more of the same, but throughout the first level of the Catacombs, I was continuously caught off guard by the things this game was doing that I just didn't expect. The first thing you do though is the only thing you do in any other Legend of Spyro game, and that's combat. Now I will admit, I went into this game with a bit of mild negativity. I was groaning and moaning and huffing and puffing, with my arms folded like a petulant child. I expected this to just be like the other Legend of Spyros, and I expected it to be bad. New game, same shit. I was fully prepared to spend the entire game mashing the same button over and over until I reached the end, kicking and screaming and crying the whole time. But before I was even granted control of the game, there was a pop-up, just a little pop-up, that lifted my spirits out of the trenches of misery and into the clouds of hope. All it said was press X for a light attack and press Y for a heavy attack. I couldn't believe it. There was more than one kind of attack. And as the tutorial went on, more and more things were revealed. You could press B to grapple your enemies and fling them around. You could use LB to block and roll. You could mix and match light and heavy attacks to make actual combos. This is what A New Beginning in the Eternal Night should have been doing. Where has this been? Fighting through that opening section, defeating those enemies and watching my combo counter tick up? I actually got a little bit giddy. I was overcome with optimism. This game could be good. And as the tutorial level went on, it just kept on looking more and more promising. The combat has taken a new form in this game, and it also sees the return of Spyro's elemental breaths. But instead of making him forget how to use them like they did in the Eternal Night, giving the developers a convenient excuse to make the game even more boring than it could have been, Spyro has access to all four elements from the very beginning. You can upgrade them and switch between them whenever and however you want right from the start. That sort of freedom and flexibility was really great to have, and even though I prioritized fire, I did find uses for the other breaths as well. Electricity was particularly useful in stunning and sometimes disarming the more defensive enemies. Earth was good for disrupting enemies when you're surrounded. They each had their uses. While they weren't as fun to use as they were in A New Beginning, where it was possible to completely cheese the combat with them, they were still implemented pretty well here in Dawn of the Dragon. Useful, but not too useful. This was all familiar territory. It was cool to see the combat be fleshed out a bit more, but it was still stuff I had seen before, and that alone was not going to be enough to set Dawn of the Dragon apart from the previous 2 games. But that was when the game caught me off guard again by allowing me to play as Cinder. When I saw that Spyro and Cinder were chained together by magic snakes, I assumed that that was just a plot point, but it's actually a pretty big part of the gameplay. Spyro and Cinder are locked together for the entirety of the game, and it's an actual mechanic. At any time, you can stop playing as Spyro and switch to playing as Cinder. Out of curiosity, I checked, and sure enough, it is possible to play this game with 2 players. You'd probably have a hard time convincing someone to do that with you. Some people still have the will to live, but I like that it's an option. I played with myself, as I often do, and being able to play as Cinder was really cool. Not that she's a good character or anything, she has as much personality as a wet towel, but it's something different and I appreciate that. What sold me on playing as Cinder is that she has her own set of elemental breaths that are completely different to Spyro's. Instead of fire, electricity, ice and earth, Cinder can wield poison, fear, wind and shadow. My favourite of these to use was poison, since with it you can actually poison enemies and cause incremental continuous damage. I don't know what it is, but I'm obsessed with poison damage. Anytime a game lets me do poison damage, I just love it. I don't understand why, but being able to cause an enemy to slowly get worn down by poison and eventually die is really satisfying to me. I think in a previous life, I must have been an assassin, hired to spike the reigning monarch's drink so some megalomaniac can swoop in and claim the crown. There's no other explanation. Cinder's poison breath was also great for racking up a massive combo count, so that's pretty cool as well. Cinder's other breaths, fear, wind and shadow, I didn't use anywhere near as much, but they did have their uses when traversing the actual levels. Cinder can use these breaths to interact with certain level elements, such as getting under specific gates, activating bridges, and blowing through a massive horn. Spyro has some of that level interactivity too, for example his electric breath can activate certain levers, but Cinder sees more of that side of the gameplay. There are actually quite a few puzzles throughout the game, and generally a greater focus on platforming and exploration. A New Beginning and the Eternal Night had this balance completely wrong. They basically went all in on the combat, realized how crap it was, and scrambled to include an occasional platforming and puzzle-focused section. Dawn of the Dragon evens up the balance pretty well to the point where there's plenty of combat, but it isn't non-stop, and you frequently have space to take a breather to explore and solve a puzzle or two. The puzzles are never anything too complicated, but they're decent enough and they actually make clever use of the co-op mechanic and having Spyro and Cinder chained together. It was in the Valley of Avalar when I realised just how different Dawn of the Dragon was going to be compared to its predecessors. The approach to how the levels work? It's almost an entirely different game. Most of them are linear, but some levels, like the Valley of Avalar, are basically mini open worlds. This is where one of Spyro's and Cinder's new abilities comes in handy. The dragons now have the ability to free fly, which means they can literally fly around whenever they want. I did find it pretty awkward to control. I understood how to get off the ground, and I could get them to land as well, but I couldn't work out how to make them actually ascend in the air, because sometimes they would do it, other times they wouldn't. It seems like they would ascend whenever they felt like it, completely independent of me controlling them. I have a much greater appreciation for the work of the Wright brothers now. This flying shit is tough. But even though it was a bit dodgy, I thought it was cool. It was an interesting idea and it gave the game more freedom to be creative with how the levels were structured. The Valley of Avalar I think perfectly demonstrates how Dawn of the Dragon sets itself apart from A New Beginning and the Eternal Night. This level is all about finding a missing cheetah from Hunter's tribe. Oh yeah, Hunter is in this game, but this version of him doesn't resemble the Hunter I know in any way, so I'm just going to pretend he's not there. There's a missing cheetah in a cave who needs to get back to the village, but he's broken his leg. The only way he can get back to the village is if Spyro and Cinder bring him a raft so he can sail back on the river. To do this, they need to get a key from the hermit, open up all the dams on the river, and use Spyro and Cinder's snake chain and free-flying ability to drag the raft to the cheetah. It was a little convoluted and a bit messy, but the level was designed in a way that was open and gave you freedom to explore, with a bit of combat here and there. It did feel like a complete waste of time when I watched Mr. Broken Leg walk back into the village in the cutscene, but it was a reasonably interesting level, by the Legend of Spyro standards at least. Guaranteed if this was a level in A New Beginning or the Eternal Night, it would have been yet another linear path where you just run through and kill a bunch of enemies, with absolutely no effort made to shake things up or make it a little more interesting. In the early stages of the game, Dawn of the Dragon had done a good job of winning me over. I went into this expecting the worst, but it was surprising me. It was doing some different things, it was spicing up the Legend of Spyro formula, it was doing what I had been asking for throughout this whole trilogy. It even added in armor pieces you can find in each level, which not only make the dragons look stupid, but also provide a small bonus like adding offensive or defensive power, or extending the duration of Fury mode, which you can use to completely obliterate your enemies. But as the game went on, and as I got more familiar with it, I realised that even with all of the additions and changes and new ideas, Dawn of the Dragon still had very similar problems to the first two games. It wasn't obvious at first, but the further into the game I got, the clearer it became that the same issues from A New Beginning and The Eternal Night are still present. They've manifested in different ways, but they're present. It all started to set in when I reached Burned Lands, which, to be fair, is one of the last levels in the game, so it took a while to hit me, but it still did hit me. It was in Burned Lands where I realised that this game, like the other two, is very repetitive, especially in the combat department. Even though the combat in this game is wildly different to how it was in the previous games, it still suffers from being repetitive. The thing is, you have all these different moves and combos and all this stuff at your disposal, and that's great, and thank you very much. But at the end of the day, none of it really matters. Not in a depressed we're all gonna die eventually kind of way, I mean it literally doesn't make a difference. The game throws loads of enemies at you and they often swarm you, so most of the time you can't even fully execute a combo. You either have to stop your combo to dodge an incoming attack, or you try and finish your combo, but you get hit by an enemy which interrupts you. So it doesn't matter if you have all these combos, because you often won't get to use them. You're too busy getting hit or dodging to actually pull them off. So what do you end up doing? You end up spamming the light attack because it's the fastest and you get more hits in before you have to dodge. And really, that's not that much different to the melee combat from the first two games. You're mashing just like before. And yes, you've got the elemental breaths, but you have a limited amount of magic, so you can't rely on that too much, or you'll literally be forced to mash. And on top of that, enemies in this game are even more defensive and evasive than they were before, and they take so many hits to die. Even if the combat takes a different form in this game, it can still wear you down in pretty much the same way. The other persisting problem inherited by this game is that the levels often feel very long and very slow. Obviously the levels are structured differently with a decent amount of combat, but more of an emphasis on exploration and solving puzzles, but they still take such a long time to get through. I reckon on average I spent about 50 minutes in a given level. By the half-hour mark, the level has worn out its welcome. You're sick of its location, you're sick of its gameplay, you just want to move on to the next one. And it's not like any of the gameplay is so good to the point where you want to stay in a level forever. Sure, it has its moments, and there are certainly a lot of games with gameplay worse than this one, but you'd get sick of it before too long. Some levels aren't that bad, the Catacombs and Ruins of Warfang were pretty cool levels that I didn't have an issue with, but the rest all suffer from their length and pace to the point where it saps you of your energy. It really is a shame that even despite all of its changes and additions, Dawn of the Dragon is still plagued by the flaws of its ancestors. It must just be an issue with the formula itself, because even with an expanded combat system, an entire second playable character, openness in some levels, free flying, a greater focus on puzzle solving, and armor, it still ended up being a slow and repetitive game. But I feel like I have to give the game some credit. At least it was trying. At least it made an effort to introduce some new ideas and offer a decent gameplay experience. And honestly, it did sort of pay off, because even though it is still a slow and repetitive game, those issues aren't as oppressive in Dawn of the Dragon as they were in the other two games. You can tell they really went for it with the presentation as well. Some of the levels have great themes, the energy is there, you can really feel the atmosphere, especially in levels like Dragon City and Attack of the Golem, where you're facing the full might of Malifaux's forces. And the game does a great job of spectacle, the levels often feel pretty grand and big, and the presence of enormous foes like the Golem and the Destroyer really make you feel puny and pathetic. The soundtrack of this game also complements that really well. I actually felt intimidated at times. And this game does also round out the story. We finally get to see Malifaux, the uber-powerful wayward evil purple dragon lord, who's been the cause of all the chaos and despair over the trilogy. Even though the Eternal Night didn't really have anything to do with anything, we get to take on his forces, fight him Dragaway Drago, and take him down in what is ironically the easiest boss fight in the whole trilogy. It was satisfying to actually defeat him and put this story to rest. even if Spyro and Cinder sacrificing themselves to literally pull the world back together was a bit much. And even if Cinder's shoehorned "I love you" at the end made me groan. And even if Ignitus somehow became the Chronicler despite having killed himself earlier on. And even if the Chronicler implied that Spyro and Cinder are still actually alive somewhere despite the hoo-ha over their sacrifice. It actually wasn't a very good story, but at least Dawn of the Dragon was able to close the book on the trilogy and put an end to it all. The Legend of Spyro Dawn of the Dragon was a bit all over the place, but I do appreciate what it was attempting to do. It took the Legend of Spyro formula and tried to spice it up. It tried to flesh out the combat by giving Spyro more moves, and also adding in Cinder as a playable character. It tried to make the levels more interesting by having a stronger focus on exploration and puzzles. It added in free flying, which was actually pretty cool, even though I couldn't wrap my head around how it actually worked. It added armor, which honestly didn't change much at all, but hey, it's something. It made an effort, which is more than A New Beginning and The Eternal Night can say. Dawn of the Dragon is a bit better than both of them. But that's not really a compliment. To put it another way, Dawn of the Dragon is the shiniest of three turds. They all have the same issues, but in Dawn of the Dragon, they just aren't as bad. It's still slow and repetitive and at times boring, but it's less of all of those things than A New Beginning and The Eternal Night. Even though I personally would rather play A New Beginning because it's fun to use the electric and earth breaths to fuck with the enemies, objectively I think Dawn of the Dragon is the most well-rounded of the three. But I think it goes without saying that Dawn of the Dragon did not redeem the trilogy. The Legend of Spyro, despite its ambitions, has ended up being a complete and utter waste of time, effort, and resources. My only question now is, how did we get here? This is so far removed from how the Spyro series started, and it's pretty much only gotten worse since then. How did this all happen? How did we start by going around colourful, vibrant levels hunting for collectibles in a charming, light-hearted world, to a trilogy of boring beat-em-ups tainted with despair and the looming threat of the end of the universe? I guess this is what killed the series for a while. Many would think that's a shame, but really that's a blessing in disguise, because it means the next Spyro game on my list is the Reignited Trilogy. And I've already got a raging stiffy for it. We're going back to basics, and I couldn't be more thrilled. But yeah, fuck The Legend of Spyro, what an absolute shit show.